Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Rogers, standing in again for William Bell as he's on his mission trip this week. I believe this is my last week standing in for him, but it's been a fun ride so far, and I look forward to the show this evening. Don, are you there?
I am here, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Hear you loud and clear.
Very, very good. Well, apologize for being just a tad late dialing in. Obviously, my clock here in my living room is running slow. I thought I had almost 10 minutes to go, and all of a sudden, you sent me a message on my phone, and my wife about the time says, "Hey, do you know what time it is? Are you going to do the show?"
Well, I was
and
thinking
it's like,
myself,
whoops.
I thought, this might end up being one guy in the Bible and not even the guy they're looking for.
Oh, goodness. Well,
I was happy to see
great.
your number. I was happy to see your number flash across the screen. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's always good to be here on Two Guys in the Bible. It's a joy to be with everyone. We appreciate all of our listeners, those who dial up the archives at later times. And, we just continue to hear from an awful lot of people, and we appreciate that so very, very much. And Daniel, I want you to know how much we appreciate you filling in for William. I know that he's had a great time down there in South America. He hasn't posted the kind of updates that I would have preferred, but he has posted, and everything has gone very, very well down there. I was reading a post this afternoon in which he said there will soon be at least a couple of preterist churches down there where he's at. He's been having both public and private Bible studies with individuals. He said everywhere he goes that the hospitality is as if you were reading the Bible, which means the hospitality is obviously great. So really looking forward to William being back on the program next week and giving us a verbal report of this trip. But it certainly sounds as if he has had a tremendously positive trip.
That's the impression that I've gotten as well. And, William has a way of making anything that he's involved in really, really good. So I had no doubts in my mind that it'd be a very good trip for William. And I'm happy to hear that it has been so far.
Yes, well, you're exactly right. He's a marvelously talented guy, excellent communicator, a great teacher. So I told him before he left, and he had mentioned the fact that he and I both have a standing invitation to have a return trip for teaching. I said, well, you go down there and lay the groundwork, get everything all set up for me, so that when I come back with you, that you've already done all the work, and all I've got to do is just do some teaching, and everybody will be ready to hear it. So, sounds to me like he's done a really great job of that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, how are things going in your world?
Oh my goodness, things are just so exciting. I tell people all the time, I say it on this program all the time, of how exciting it is to be living in the time that we are living in. Pardon me. I have gotten messages this week. It's only Tuesday, but I've gotten emails this week from people telling me that they've been watching the YouTube videos and they have been dispensational all their life, but now they are no longer dispensational. They are, as a matter of fact, full preterists, and they were expressing their gratitude and appreciation for the videos. And that type of response is just so thoroughly exciting and wonderful and humbling to hear from people. And it's not just one. It's not an isolated situation. We just continue to hear from people literally all over the world on a constant basis, on a growing basis, who are coming to an understanding of the faithfulness of God to keep his promises when he said he was going to. And so it's just absolutely fantastic. And this program, pardon me, this program is a part of that outreach as people are able to tune in and they're able to listen to the studies that we do here on this program and that we share our understanding of the biblical narrative. It's I've said this very, very often. Who would have thought 20 years ago of such a thing as YouTube? Who would have thought of such a thing as Facebook? Now, I don't even know if they were around 20 years ago, but I know 20 years ago, pardon me, 20 years ago, the people in my circles had certainly never heard of them at all. And yet now, as a result of participation in YouTube and Facebook, I know that it has radically transformed my ministry and my outreach, just expanding it exponentially. So it's just absolutely fantastic.
Well, it's not every day that somebody gets the opportunity to preach to, 200, 300, 500 people at a time, like you do with your morning musings.
Well, I told somebody just the other day on my on my YouTube, the last time I looked, I have right at 2,300 official subscribers. And that means I essentially have a, quote, congregation, unquote, of 2,300 people. Now, that's just official subscribers to whom those YouTube videos are posted every single morning that I produce them. And that doesn't count the people who are not subscribers who log in. And I can tell you this, since I began this study on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, my viewership has gone up by about 100, sometimes 150 people per day over what previous studies had been. So that tells you the interest that is out there. And the response to that has just been absolutely fantastic. What has been so interesting is that detractors, when they have posted, they have completely ignored, 100% completely ignored the exegetical points that I made in the video. And then thrown out some of these, what I call but arguments. And what I mean by that is they're going, yeah, but what about this? What about that? What about this? And as I have continually challenged some of these detractors, first of all, deal with the exegetical points that I made. Because if the exegetical points that I made are valid, then your objection is invalid. And they don't even try. I mean, they literally don't even try. In so many instances, they just continue with their but type of arguments, many of which, in fact, I would even say, the great majority of which completely and totally presuppositional, without any attempt whatsoever at an exegetical response. It's just, you're a false teacher, you're a heretic, you're a liar, you're this, you're that. Well, as I keep telling them, you can call all the names that you want to, but calling names does not prove that you're right and that I'm wrong. It doesn't say a word about the validity of the position that I'm teaching. So it's amazing as we continue to see the attempts, if you can even call them that, the attempts of the detractors of covenant eschatology to respond to what we're saying. It's really, really quite weak when you consider what is being said.
Right, and those little yabbits, they jump up all over the place when you're having an in-depth conversation with somebody, and I think.
Pardon me. Yes.
I think that those yabbits are pretty good indicators that what you've said, it can't be answered, or at least not by the individual that you're talking to. It's just a deflection.
That's exactly right.
That's
like exactly right. Go ahead.
It's like when you're studying Daniel 12 with somebody, and you set up the context, and you show when the power of the holy people would be completely shattered, and the connections between Daniel 12 and Matthew 24, and they say, yeah, but physical bodies didn't come out of the dust in AD 70.
Right.
That's
exactly. And it goes on and on and on. And that brings us to what we are trying to share in this current series here on Fulfilled Radio, and that is how to understand biblical prophecy. The principles for understanding the Bible. It's not just Bible prophecy, but of course the Bible is so much about prophecy, but rather it is how do we understand the Bible, period. And so what we've been sharing are some principles that everyone can apply. These are not esoteric. They're not hard to understand. They're not out there. As a matter of fact, the principles that we have been sharing to this point are, in fact, principles that the Bible itself sets forth as principles of interpretation. And if we do not accept the Bible's own statements about how to understand it, then we're not going to understand it. That's all there is to it. Pardon me. For some reason, I'm having an awful lot of trouble with my voice tonight, just like I did last week. I guess the allergy pollens are way, way up here. So anyway, I've already shared here on this program, Daniel, that one of the very first principles of understanding the Bible is to understand it was written by Hebrews to Hebrews, and it was written about Hebraic promises. Now, I don't have to tell you that, and even though you haven't been on the firing line as many years as I have, you've already encountered the realization or the fact that most detractors of covenant eschatologies, they just don't seem to understand anything at all about audience relevance. That we have to understand who the Bible was written by, who it was written to, who it was written about, in order to understand what it was really saying. If we do not take into consideration what the German scholars call the Zetzenleben. Now, the Zetzenleben means the real life situation. Their world. If we don't understand their world, their culture, their time, then we are already automatically doomed to misinterpret the Bible. And yet you and I both encounter people, probably on an almost everyday basis, who virtually reject the idea of audience relevance. Now, I know this is an extreme example, Daniel, but I want to tell everyone about it, share it with you. Not long ago, on Facebook, it was on one of my YouTube videos, I had emphasized the importance of audience relevance. And I had this individual post back and say The doctrine and the concept of audience relevance is an invention of the devil. It is one of the most heinous claims that could possibly be made. It is false. And I'm going, whoa, that hurt my eyes just to read that. Just to say that we don't pay attention to audience relevance of literature and that's an evil doctrine? How in the world could anyone say such a thing? Well, we went back and forth, this individual and I did, over several days. And then he disappeared. And lo and behold, about 6 weeks after we had that exchange going back and forth with one another, this same individual posted on one of my YouTubes saying, "This Don Preston is one of the greatest Bible teachers I have ever encountered." And I'm going, whoa. Whoa. What happened here? And of course, obviously, that was a great thing to read. I suppose that was their way of an apology for calling me a false teacher and a heretic. But it came across that they had thought, they had rethought, they had reconsidered, and had come to the realization that, you know what, audience relevance really is valid. It really is important. So we're trying to emphasize that in sharing these biblical principles, because when the New Testament writers tell us who their audience is, when the New Testament writers tell us what the context of their subject is, i.e. the Old Covenant, and that was point number 2 of understanding the Bible principles, but when they tell us this over and over and over again, it really is incumbent upon us to pay attention to what they're saying. Well, the second point of understanding Bible prophecy is to understand that all of the New Testament writers were Jews, and they tell us that their eschatological hope was nothing different from, and it was only what was written in Moses, the law, and the prophets. This is absolutely astounding to me. Now, Daniel, you and I were raised in a culture, a theological culture, that said God was through with Israel at the cross. God was through with the old law at the cross. And I well remember, and I was older than you are when the realization came, but I remember sitting in my office one day reading what Paul had to say in Acts 24:14 and following. But this I confess to you, that after the way that they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things that are written in Moses, the law, and the prophets, that there is about to be the resurrection of the just and of the unjust. And I literally stood up from my chair going, in my mind, my head, I think, was spinning on my shoulders. And I don't know that I verbalized anything out loud, but I know that internally I was going, whoa, 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 no, whoa, I've got a problem here. If God was through with Israel at the cross, if the old covenant was done away at the cross, then how could it be true that Paul, years after the cross, was still anticipating the fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel? There's something wrong here. And it wasn't Paul that was wrong. It was my theology. It was my eschatology. That was one of those, what do they call them, Kodak moments? Well, it was one of those moments that I knew then and there that my eschatology was based upon an entirely wrong premise. It was a stunning moment.
I remember that moment as well. And I remember starting to preach on types and shadows, and how there were still things that the time that I was preaching that, in my mind, there were still things future that were fulfillment of Old Testament promises. I was struggling with eschatology at that point. But I remember that realization as well, and just thinking, how have we missed such an important teaching that these promises were made to Israel? Jesus didn't come to destroy these, but he came to confirm the promises made to the fathers. It just blew my mind, especially because of the culture that you and I were raised in.
Well, that's absolutely right. So, and here's the deal. In debate after debate after debate with both amillennialists and postmillennialists, I have asked my opponents, are your eschatological hopes based upon and taken from God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? They have said, almost without exception, no. When I asked David Hester that prior to our debate last year in July 2016, he said, no, my hope is firmly grounded in the Abrahamic and the Davidic promises. Or perhaps he said Edenic and Abrahamic. Well, that creates a false dichotomy, a false division in the biblical story of eschatology. I have said this over and over and over again. There is but one eschatological hope taught in Scripture. That one eschatological hope began in the garden when God told Eve that her seed would crush the head of Satan. That's the beginning of the eschatological story of the Bible. And so, going from there, that one hope is incorporated into the Abrahamic resurrection hope. Abraham's eschatological resurrection hope was incorporated into Israel's eschatological hope and became epitomized within that framework. And the New Testament is unequivocally clear, pardon me, that one hope is, which is now called Israel's hope. That doesn't mean that Paul was ever saying, oh, this is different from Abraham and this is different from Eve, Adam and Eve. Doesn't say that at all. Doesn't intimate that. Their hope became Israel's hope. Israel's hope was their hope. But the Scriptures are unequivocally clear that the hope of Israel would be fulfilled at the end of Old Covenant Israel's covenant age, not at the end of time. And in my debate with Dr. David Hester, when I pointed this out over and over again, he completely, totally ignored it. He literally did not say one word about this idea. And that is more than revealing. In my very first affirmative, I pointed out, here's what David Hester says about his eschatological hope. Here's what Paul says about his eschatological hope. That means David Hester is preaching a different gospel from what Paul taught. Not one word from David Hester. I repeated that point at least 2 other times the debate. Literally not one word from David Hester. Now, it is also true, this has happened in other debates, one debate after another, especially with Church of Christ ministers. They simply cannot deal with the fact that the promise of the resurrection was a promise, a covenant promise, made to Old Covenant Israel, found in Moses, the law, and the prophets. Because to admit that, pardon me, to admit that is to admit that a fundamental principle, a foundation, both a foundation and a pillar of their entire eschatological house has just crumbled to the ground. And that's just all there is to it.
I agree. I think what we've done and why the Church of Christ particularly has become so anti-Israel anything past the cross is because of a reactionary hermeneutic to premillennialism. I mean, you ask someone what they believe on the millennium, they're not going to tell you what they believe on the millennium. They'll tell you what the premillennialists believe and say, I don't believe that. Well, that doesn't do much to answer the question. And so what they've done is premillennialism is in one ditch, and instead of getting down the center of the road, they go jump in the other ditch, so they're not identified as premillennialists by their peers by placing emphasis on Israel.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Oh, and by the way, a little digression here. Speaking of premillennialists, April the 10th, I will be debating Dr. Jaime Pickett, who is a progressive dispensationalist. Now, he says and he affirms some differences between dispensationalism and progressive dispensationalism. But the fundamental doctrine that we will be debating, and that is whether or not, quote, all Israel, unquote, was saved in AD 70, or if that's yet future at some proposed second coming at the end of the Christian age. He will, of course, affirm that all Israel will be saved at the second coming of Christ, which comes after the rapture, after the Great Tribulation, abomination of desolation, after the Great Tribulation, man of sin, and all of that kind of stuff. So that will be on YouTube. Our plans are also that it will be live on Facebook, and it will most assuredly, if we cannot get it set up to be live on Two Guys and a Bible, then it will certainly be archived on Two Guys and a Bible. So be watching for that. We'll be posting the specific information about the times. Hello?
Oh,
Hello?
Sorry. I thought I was talking to. Hang on a second. Continue on. Sorry about that.
Okay. Pardon me. I was just informing everybody to be sure to be watching for the details for my debate with Dr. Jaime Pickett on YouTube and Facebook, and hopefully right here on Two Guys in the Bible on April the 10th. I'm really, really looking forward to debating Dr. Pickett. Are you there, Daniel? Daniel, did I lose you? Hello? Hello, Daniel? Okay. Well, I don't know if Daniel lost me or if I lost Daniel. It doesn't show on my screen that my call has been terminated. So, folks, what I'm going to do, if you can hear me here on...
He can hear you. Air. They can hear you, Don. Sorry about that.
Okay, okay.
What we have is a caller. Gerald Davis would like to say a few words about the Church of Christ in connection to Israel.
Very good. Folks, a little bit of a background. Gerald is a wonderful friend, excellent scholar, in my opinion.
Has been terminated.
Gerald, are you with us?
Oh, yes, I'm with you. I was just it's good to see you back. I'm constantly amazed at all the stuff you do. I don't know how you keep all those platters spinning at the same time.
Well, it's always great to have you. Always great to have your input. I appreciate your scholarship so very, very much. Sometimes correcting me, and that's just fine.
And sometimes we disagree too.
That's right. Sometimes we do, but that's okay.
That's okay. Now, I was just y'all had talked about in Churches of Christ why we have so often drawn the bright line at the cross and said that it couldn't go past. You know, the old covenant. The old covenant ended. A lot of that has to do with Alexander Campbell's. He has a famous Sermon on the Law. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Certainly him.
Okay, and a lot of our hermeneutic goes back to that particular sermon in which he, in a sense, he really drew kind of a bright line there.
You are exactly right. The effect of his speech on the law was absolutely profound on the history of the Restoration movement, which is the Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ Christian Church movement. And I really don't know of anything that he did other than his debates with the atheist that had more of a profound impact on the movement that had begun. I remember, and Gerald, do you know, and Daniel, I don't know if you would know or not, but since it's been several years, but Gerald, do you remember Robert Shank?
Oh, yes. He came out of the matter of fact. I even went to the Pearl Street Lectures in Denton.
I was there.
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
in 1983.
I actually met with him afterward. They wouldn't allow him to sell his books, but I actually got books from him that he had to sell out of his trunk because while they would allow him to speak, they would only allow him to speak so that they could take pot shots at him.
Indeed. Well,
yes.
Robert Shank was a good friend of mine. My mother supported him financially, and he had been in her home, and I had been in his home. Robert Shank was one of the most humble men I've ever met in my life, and just a truly great man in a lot of ways. We obviously disagreed on our eschatology.
Oh, yeah.
But we had him speak when I was the minister at the East Main Church of Christ in Shawnee, Oklahoma, from 1975 to 1985, 86 rather. And I will never, ever forget that Robert Shank said in that lesson, and by the way, I want to go back to the Pearl Street Lectures there. It's amazing that you were there, and of course we obviously did not know one another at the time. But, pardon me, Robert Shank in his presentation, now for the listeners of Two Guys in the Bible here, Robert Shank came out of the Baptist Church and joined the Churches of Christ. He wrote a couple of books, Life in the Sun and Elect in the Sun. Both of those are excellent, excellent books having to do with once in grace, always in grace doctrine, the other, the doctrine of election. They're out of print now. I don't know how a person would ever get a hold of one except online somewhere.
I've got a couple.
But yeah. But anyway, he had a ministry in which he would reach out to anyone in any denomination that would be willing to listen to the restoration plea. And so we had him at the East Main Church of Christ. And in many ways, his lesson was excellent. It told of his own personal journey, of changing his mind, of being challenged to change his paradigm, et cetera, et cetera. And he made the comment. He said, one of, if not the greatest contributions to the modern theological landscape is the contribution of Alexander Campbell in his lesson on the law. And the ensuing position of the Churches of Christ that the law of Moses passed away at the cross. Well, Gerald, I don't have to tell you, and Daniel, I don't have to tell you, for a premillennialist to say that God was through with Israel at the cross is really self-defeating. And that is especially true because in 1983 at the Pearl Street lectureship that Gerald Davis just mentioned a moment ago, Robert Shank was debating Wayne Jackson on the issue of dispensationalism. Robert Shank was affirming that Israel still has a future, which raises the question, how can Israel be a covenant people with a covenant future, and yet her covenant, the law of Moses, was done away with at the cross? Robert Shank never saw that dichotomy. He never saw that problem at all. And I know one time in his home, he and I discussed these things, and he tried to go back to the Abrahamic and the Davidic covenants. But my question to him was, how do you divorce the Abrahamic covenant, which was incorporated into, subsumed into the Mosaic covenant, just as was the Davidic covenant was appended to the Mosaic covenant. It was not something radically different from it. It became part and parcel of it. And so that failure was a massive failure on his part that he never could grasp. Even though he and I had probably, I think we had about a 2.5-hour study in his study at his home in Mount Vernon, Missouri, several years before he passed away, actually. So that's a little bit of the background of what Gerald Davis is saying. And by the way, Gerald, I don't know if you have any memory whatsoever of this or not, but when they opened up the floor mic, I was the very first person to the mic, and I asked a question about Daniel 9 and the so-called gap between the 69th and the 70th week, making a few points. And Robert Schenck was very gracious. He said, that's the very best question that I've heard, that I have been challenged with. He didn't do a very good job of answering it. But he and I actually went out to eat while I was there. And boy, did I ever get raked over the coals for going out to eat with him. Wow.
Well, now, was this before you had become a preterist?
I was very deeply involved in my own eschatological struggles, Gerald.
Okay.
I knew that I did not hold the traditional view of the Churches of Christ anymore. And the reason that I had, among other things, but one of the reasons that I attended that debate and Denton lectures between Wayne Jackson and Robert Schenck was because I was already in the midst of preparation to have my very first formal debate with a dispensationalist later that year. And I thought, well, Wayne Jackson will just tear Robert Schenck up and give me some great information. And so much of Wayne Jackson's entire approach was horribly presuppositional. It simply was not valid. It simply was not good. He gave me nothing to deal with dispensationalism with. As a very quick point, here is Robert Schenck arguing for a so-called, and so far, 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27. Well, Wayne Jackson just ripped him up for that and said there is no justification for that. That is unbiblical. It is false doctrine. It is this. It is that. Well, then, guess what Wayne Jackson did? He cited Matthew 16, 27, 28. The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according as his work shall be. And verily, I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming. Wayne Jackson took verse 27 as the end of time and then jumped backward from the end of time, who knows how long that will be, to the day of Pentecost. In other words, he put a gap in the period between verse 27 and verse 28. Now, unfortunately, Robert Schenck did not point out his humongous self-contradiction. Robert Schenck never caught that. But in the debate book or in the lectureship book, printed later, much later, guess what? Wayne Jackson commented on that gap. And he said, it should not disturb us that Jesus in verse 27 talks about the end of time, and verse 28 is the day of Pentecost. Because the Bible very often discusses things that are widely separated in time. And I'm going, okay, so Robert Schenck is a heretic for inserting a gap between the 69th and the 70th week, and yet you turn around and say the Bible very often inserts long periods of time into text without any indication of doing so. Gotcha.
Well, we have always looked at our own pet way of interpreting things as, well, that's the logical way. I remember when I was first taught about Matthew 24, and I was given a fourfold division. I don't know if you were ever taught the fourfold division or not.
I wasn't taught it, but I've read it.
Yeah, and they give the deal about two mountains and there's valleys in between, but the two mountains
Indeed.
look like they're close. All that kind of stuff. Which when you're struggling for a way to put something into context, you grab the thing that most easily fits your paradigm.
Yes. And that is exactly what has happened. I have been astounded lately to read some of the comments, for instance, of Dr. David Hester in regard to Matthew 24. He takes that type of division of the Olivet Discourse, which to me is just one of the most stunningly awful, but it's just a stunningly awful interpretation of the Olivet Discourse. It completely disconnects the Olivet Discourse from the Jewish eschatological narrative, which is very clear, which is enunciated by Jesus right there in Matthew 24. It's enunciated and outlined by the other writers of the New Testament, but it is if Dr. David Hester is completely and totally unfamiliar with the Jewish timeline of eschatology and the events that they placed in the last days, consummating in the day of the Lord, which is precisely the narrative that Jesus follows in Matthew chapter 24. But because David Hester has this concept of a literal physical coming of the Lord at the end of time, and since he cannot accept the temporal statements in Matthew chapter 24, he divides it up, chops it up into this rather disconcerting, confused and confusing, I might add, construct that you just have to wonder if he imbibed a Burton Kaufman in his commentary, if you're familiar with that. Burton Kaufman, folks, was a Church of Christ commentator, wrote a series of commentary on the entire New Testament. And when it came to the Olivet Discourse, Burton Kaufman said Jesus was purposely unclear in his narrative. It was Jesus' intent not to speak clearly in regard to eschatology. Now, that's a paraphrase, but that's the point that Burton Kaufman took. So we're supposed to believe that even though the disciples asked questions, about eschatology, Jesus purposely confused them. He purposely kept them in the dark. It's just astounding that good men who love the Lord, I'm not impugning anyone's integrity or their love for the Lord at all, but it's just astounding to me that good men would actually come up with the idea that Jesus purposely confused people and kept them purposely in the dark.
Yeah. Now, is Dr. Hester, is he doing a fourfold division or a twofold division of Matthew 24?
A twofold. Yeah, he's got twofold division.
Okay. Well, see, I was taught that that 29, through 31 was second coming.
Yes.
Most of our folks now have gone to a twofold division. But when I was first taught it, I was taught that 29 through 31 was actually end of time passage. So there was actually a fourfold division that Jesus kind of mixed everything up.
Yes. Well, that's what I was taught in preacher school / seminary, that verses 4 through 34 referred to the events leading up to and consummating in AD 70. And I would even add this. Dr. David Hester, in our first debate back in July of last year, Dr. David Hester admitted that Matthew 24 speaks of AD 70, the coming of the Lord in AD 70. But then he turns right around and he knows that if he admits that, that's very, very problematic for his eschatology. And so when he sent me some answers to written questions this last week, some of the positions that he took indicated to me that he now actually rejects the view that verses 29 to 31 do refer to AD 70. So I'll be really honest with you. Who knows what he believes? Based upon the comments that he made in his written answers, one has to ponder, one has to really question what David Hester might possibly believe about the Olivet Discourse.
In other words,
it was very confusing.
So you're not sure if he posits 29 through 31 as AD 70?
Correct. After what he said in his written answers.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That is very interesting.
One thing to note about the divisions in Matthew 24 is that J.W. McGarvey actually put, beginning in verse 29, I believe it is, he says, since the coming of Christ did not follow close upon the destruction of Jerusalem, the word immediately used by Matthew is somewhat puzzling. So that's where a lot of this struggle came from. Well,
that's true. And to return to Dr. Hester here, he says that there's a division at verse 27. But, if someone says he is in the desert, do not go out there. If he's in the closet, do not go there. Because as the lightning it flashes from the east to the west, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. He says that is a break in Jesus' discussion of the events leading up to AD 70. That's a reference to the final coming. Well, if you take verse 27 and 28 as referring to the final coming, then what do you do with verse 29? As Daniel shared with us, J.W. McGarvey said, well, since the literal coming didn't happen in AD 70, the word immediately is troublesome. Well, that's to say the very least. That little word immediately there, the Greek word eutheos, is used something like 82 times, if memory serves me correctly, something like 82 times in the New Testament. And there is no getting around the fact that it means, well, immediately. You cannot slip 2,000 years into it to save your life. There is just simply there's no linguistic, there's no contextual justification for saying that immediately can possibly stretch out 2,000 years. It just doesn't work.
Well, now, if he breaks between verses 26 and 27, that's a new one on me. I thought I was pretty familiar with most of our CFC folks on Matthew 24.
Well, Gerald, I have to tell you, and Daniel and I have spoken about this, William and I have spoken about this, the more that I share covenant eschatology with people, and I said this on the program last week, I coined a Latin term some years ago, and it normally gets a little bit of a chuckle, and I mean, I coined it with being facetious, but at the same time, there's a serious side to it, and that Latin term is argumentum ad desperatum.
Yes.
And, my interpretation, my translation of that is an argument from desperation. What we have witnessed, what we continue to witness, is that the opponents of covenant eschatology find themselves simply unable to deal with the exegesis that the preterist movement offers. And so they start literally making up brand spanking new arguments that are virtually unknown in the entire history of Bible commentary. And I'm just absolutely astounded at times when I read things like that. Now, I have personally read commentators try to draw a division at verse 27. It's an unusual view in the churches of Christ, but I have read that view in some other commentators. So there are just so many views out there that attempt to deal with the Olivet Discourse, and the way they're trying to deal with it is to hold on to their futurist eschatology. Somehow, some way, they have to deal with the text, and they have to hold on to their futurist eschatology. So what do? They manipulate the text, and they create false divisions within the text that on any normal reading of the text, you would never, ever, ever come up with those ideas. But again, sometimes theology trumps exegesis. Sometimes tradition trumps exegesis. And so as a result of that, once again, we have a twofold, a threefold, or a fourfold division of the Olivet Discourse, all of which are basically artificial. There's nothing in the text to justify them. So that's why I call them argumentum ad desperatum. They are arguments from unmitigated desperation.
Yeah, and they're also done in a way that they wouldn't allow other people to do it on other issues.
That is an understatement.
There's the Bible professor at Oklahoma Christian College, used to be dean and I think the vice president. I'm trying to think of his name. He's now retired, but he still does stuff.
Stafford North?
Pardon me? Yeah,
Stafford.
Yes, Stafford. Have you looked at what he does in refuting the 80-70 doctrine?
I was present in 1990, I guess it was, when he gave a presentation on the 80-70 doctrine. And I sat there stunned at how self-contradictory Dr. North's presentation was. A good friend of mine from our congregation was with me, and he was an excellent Bible student in his own right. And he turned to me and he says, I can't believe what I'm hearing. Is this guy serious? And, here's a man that took the position that when we see the language of the Lord coming on the clouds of heaven, we should not think in literal terms. But what does he do on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4? Well, that's literal. And he comes to Matthew 24, and he said the disciples were asking about the end of the Jewish age that came in AD 70. And you're going, well, thank you, Dr. North. I appreciate that very, very much. And I'm sure that you've read his work on the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation. And he really does some pretty good work in there, all the time defeating his own eschatology. You can go through, as I have, and you can underline all of the points that he makes. You can extrapolate them logically, scripturally, and apply them to the proper application of eschatology, and you wind up with covenant eschatology. And by the way, after his presentation, I stood up from the audience and challenged him to debate me publicly. And I had known Brother North for a good long while. We were not close friends or anything. I'm not trying to imply that. But we had certainly known one another on a first-name basis. And so I stood up, and he said, "Hi, Don, how you doing?" And I said, "Brother North, I've listened very carefully to your presentation." And I said, "I obviously disagree with you." And he said, "Yes, I know you do, Don." And I said, "I want to formally challenge you here and now to meet me in a formal public debate on this issue." And I know that he had to have expected that to be coming. but anyway, he said, "Well, Don, I'll think about that." That was the end of it. We were dismissed. I got up on the platform with him, up on the stage with him, and I said, Now, Dr. North, I said, I'm very serious about this debate. I said, I would love to debate you. And he goes, well, Don, I know you would. And he said, I'll give that some thought. He said, I'll look at my calendar and see what's there. And needless to say, his calendar was invariably full. There was no opportunity whatsoever for a debate. So that pretty much ended that.
Well, what struck me about reading the paper, I guess probably might have been the paper that he actually presented, was how in one section he contradicts what he says in another section. Because one of his arguments was that in AD 70 there wasn't any deal about angels. But he does take a twofold division, and he places 29 through 31 as AD 70.
Yes.
And there are angels there that, of course, he talks about as ministers of the gospel or whatever. But there are angels there in the passage that he specifically posits as AD 70. But yet he says, hey, there weren't any angels in AD 70.
Right.
Self-contradictory.
Well, that was the nature of it, and that was the paper that he presented. And that's some of the stuff that my friend and I sit there just going, does he not understand how he's contradicting himself? I mean, it was really, both the paper and the presentation was really, may I use the term, and again, I mean no disrespect to Dr. North. He was a very, very nice guy. And like I say, we had known each other for some years before that on a first-name basis. So, I mean, no disrespect to him at all. But his presentation was absolutely superficial. It was obvious to me he had given no serious thought to actually examining the exegetical arguments that we offer. It was just like, well, I got to get up and give a 45-minute presentation to prove this doctrine false. Okay, here we go. And it was bad. It was very, very bad. So, well, listen, Gerald, we thank you so very, very much for calling in. It's always great to hear from you. By the way, I've got to send you an email. I've got a few Greek questions that I want to ask you for some clarification. I think I understand, but I'm not 100% certain. I've been reading Wallace, trying to get some clarification in my own mind, but I'm still looking for a little bit of help on it. But be that as it may, I'll be sending you an email just as soon as I can get a little bit of time to do that. But again, thanks for calling in. It's always a joy to speak to you.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Daniel, if you don't know Gerald, he's a really great guy, educated through Abilene Christian University. He also excellent Greek student, and very, very helpful to me. He and I do disagree on some points, but he always has some great insights, and sometimes challenges me. But that's a good thing. It's always good to be challenged, to make our thinking clear. And to make it as careful and to make it as conservative, to use the term, and to make it as powerful as we possibly can. So he's a great benefit to me.
Oh, no doubt. He seemed like a very intelligent and nice guy, and I enjoyed the conversation that y'all had together. That was very good.
Yeah.
One thing about I was going to say one
ahead.
thing about the angels in AD 70. You remember Elisha in 2 Kings 6. He had to tell his servant, he had to open up his servant's eyes so he could see all the chariots of fire. So
That's
to
exactly
categorically
right.
say that there were no angels is just forgetting about the entire Bible and how God sometimes operated in an invisible fashion.
That's right. And I would suggest that is a key element in the interpretation of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. That entire concept, not only of angels, but of Christ's work in the Hadean realm, was likewise in the unseen realm. And for us to overlook or to ignore that and to just simply say, well, that couldn't possibly be, as you suggested, it ignores a whole lot of biblical testimony, and we dare not do that. So, listen, folks, thank you so very, very much for joining us this evening on Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And Daniel, let me say again how much I appreciate you being the co-host on this program. You've stood in very well. You've done an admirable job on the technology that I have no earthly clue how to do. When William had told me and given me instructions a time or two when he was going to have to be gone, and I tried to do it, it did not work. It would not work. And it just reinforced that when it comes to technology, Don Preston is completely out of his realm. I don't like it. So,
well, I had
anyway,
a tough time getting it on board tonight, but I was finally able to get it. So.
Well, you see, you knew sort of kind of how to go about doing it, though. Preston doesn't know how to go about doing it. And I'm struggling with that at my office still, trying to get my Apple to communicate with my router, my new router and my new modem. I cannot for the life of me get it done. I was going to do that this afternoon. I was going to call you and see if you could walk me through that and get some help with it, but I got so incredibly busy and tied up this afternoon, I couldn't get it done. Well, anyway, we are out of time. Daniel, thank you again. Folks, thank you again. Thanks to Gerald Davis for calling in and offering his excellent comments. Be with us again next week at 6 o'clock Central Time on Two Guys and a Bible, right here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. William Bell will be back with us, Lord willing. He will give us a report on his trip to South America and how things went. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Don Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.